overview, which we are now calling red plus green or green plus red, depending on the document that you read. And so be prepared for that name shift as you see things. We are popping in to the chat these notes or this slide deck, which has a note taker with it. That note taker might be really handy for you as you learn about the 4 learning modules that we're going to share with you today. Also, we have links to a parking lot for questions, but also feel free to type those in the chat. We want you to get all of your questions answered today before you leave. There's a Padlet that we'll be using today, as well as a needs assessment at the end, so that we know how to best support you guys moving forward. And so lots of ways to grab this information, but hopefully you can follow along and be part of the learning with us today. Our main goal for you today is to walk away with a clear understanding of possible teaching models that can be used in your classroom, supporting both in-person and at-home students through our new transition that we're going to be happening. We're going to provide 4 models with sample schedules, as well as some additional resources for you to get some more information. And as well, we will be sharing some next steps for some deeper dives to help you really plan what this could look like in your classroom. And so that's kind of the overview that we're going to be offering for you today. We're also going to take a look at all of this information through the lens of what we can control. We know we can't control what's happening at the district, and we have little control over what's happening at the school. So we're really focusing on the teacher and the student interactions. We're focusing on the instruction that can happen within a classroom and really kind of pulling it down to what teachers can do to really make their content stick for students during these last couple months of school. And so that's kind of the lens of all 4 models that we'll be sharing with you today. The other things that are within your control that we hope that you're thinking about is how you will make curriculum meaningful. What are those essential standards, or what are those ideas that are going to get you through the rest of your school year? What digital tools have been working for both you and your students? And how will you continue to build on those strengths? How will you utilize small groups to support differentiated instruction and really make connection for your students? What behavior supports are in place, including systems and routines that your students can already start building in virtually so that they can get more prepared for being at school? And then how are you communicating with both students and families, which is going to be very important as this transition happens, making sure that everybody knows exactly what's going on. And so those are things that you do have choice over, and we just wanted to pull some attention to make sure that that you're aware that we're also able to support in all of these ways. So if you need a thought partner, if you need some ideas or strategies, please reach out to us. These are all areas that we also support. Now, all of the 4 models that we're going to be sharing with you today are going to build off of what you've already been doing. And so we're going to take a minute real quick and think about what's gone well. What's going well for you? What's going well for your students? What are those topics and themes that your students are gravitating towards? And if you wouldn't mind sharing those ideas on the Padlet that was just dropped into the chat. So you'll also see on there lots of ideas from other teachers who have had this same overview session. So you might also be able to gain some power in numbers as you see your colleagues have been sharing the same ideas. So again, we're going to build off of the ideas of what's going well, but we know that there have also been challenges in distance learning. So if you want to also take a minute and share some of the things that have been challenging, what's not gone as planned, what do you hope to get some more resources or support in so that you can overcome those challenges as we move into red and green learning happening at the school sites. So if you don't mind just taking a quick minute and adding to the Padlet both of those ideas, and we will also be adding to those as we continue through this presentation. Again, I'll say it over and over again, but as you're adding in those ideas, we really do want to pull out the things that have gone well and the amazing ways that teachers have really shifted over this last year and learned so many new ideas. So we don't want you to stop any of those great things that have been happening for you or for your students. Now that we're transitioning, we're hoping to only build on those. So what are those things that you've learned since March? The strategies about you as a person, about technology, and we really want to build on those. So our goal for these 4 models is to really provide the research and the resources around these 4 examples to continue to build off of what you've been doing. We do not, again, want you to stop any of the things that you have been doing and take over any of these models. Rather, find the model that best fits the way that things have been working well for you in your classroom. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who's going to lead us through our first couple models and help us get our mind working in how this could look in our classrooms.
Thank you so much, Andrea. So what you see in front of you are a series of reflection questions. And as Andrea said, we are approaching this from a research lens. We've been working on this for several months on pulling the best resources we can for you. And the questions you see in front of you are adapted from the University of Berkeley, where they've been working in a hybrid environment for a long time, decades now. And these are questions that they have their professors consider. We've adapted them for elementary and for our particular district. But this is the beginning of an approach to really thinking critically and carefully about how we approach this transition in our instruction. And Rachel, do you have that note taker ready to go? Awesome. These questions are also in the note taker. And so what we would love for you to do is to think about these questions, not just right now, but while you're choosing a model and after you choose your model, to revisit the series of questions. And the note taker does have space for you to write down your thoughts. And then it also at the very bottom has a tool that I highly recommend for what's about to happen next. We are going to share with you 4 different models, which you can see in this chart: synchronous, semi-synchronous, flipped, and station rotation. And to have this note taker up in another tab is really handy because we're going to share a lot of information with you, and we will pause at the end of each model so that you can jot down your thoughts, maybe thoughts to share with a colleague or thoughts for yourself about which model is best for you. And so before we get started, I'd like to share a couple definitions just so that we have the same vocabulary. Synchronous instruction is sometimes called the concurrent model when we're discussing hybrid, but the word synchronous is older than the pandemic. It's older than hybrid. And synchronous means an instructional model where we are doing the same things at the same time. So when you hear that word, this is a helpful way to think about it. The synchronous doesn't just mean virtual learning, but it can also be in person or in a hybrid scenario. Similarly with asynchronous, it just means we're doing different things at different times. And hybrid is where we have some students who are at home, some students who are in person. And so when we talk about hybrid in green plus red, we know that some of our students will elect to stay home. And so that by nature puts us into a hybrid model. The final definition is blended learning, which talks about using technology tools and station rotation models to really leverage for differentiation. And Maggie will talk more about that in a little bit. So we're going to get started, and we're going to start talking about the first model, synchronous instruction. And I will share with you synchronous and semi-synchronous, and then I will hand it over to Maggie, who will talk to you about flipped and station rotation. Okay, so in a synchronous model, we are looking at delivering instruction simultaneously for students both in person, on campus, and virtually, who are at home. And on this page, you're going to see a graphic that shows that students who are at home in a different space in each of their little rooms are working and plugging into the lesson that's happening in the classroom. And if you look carefully at this image, you'll see that the students that do not have a computer in front of them in this particular example, but they're working on books, and the teacher is up there at the front teaching live and being recorded to the students who are at home. We've linked here 2 articles that we highly recommend if you would like to learn more about the synchronous model. But we're going to go forward and look at a schedule of what this might look like from a schedule perspective for in a classroom. So in a classroom that is in a synchronous model, all students would participate in the morning meeting. Students in the classroom would participate without a device, and then the students who are at home would log in to participate in the morning meeting. They would then move into their reading mini lesson, whole group. And then they would break into independent practice. And what you're going to notice with this schedule is that there is an emphasis on whole group, morning meeting, whole group, mini lesson, whole group. Even our independent practice is all of us doing the same thing at the same time. So our whole group of students is doing the same learning activity. You may have this as an opportunity for students who are at home to close their devices and to work on the activity on a piece of paper so they have some off-screen time, or you may elect for everybody to do the same activity on a device at the same time. For example, everyone may work on a Jamboard. Then you would have your next whole group mini lesson, and then you would have more independent practice. And the day follows the same pattern, emphasis on whole group. Okay, so there are some benefits and considerations for this model. Some real benefits are that students receive the same instruction. Your students who are at home and your students who are in the classroom are receiving the same instruction at the same time. Students have that opportunity for immediate feedback. If your students are logged onto their device, but working on their piece of paper at home, they can raise their hand and ask the teacher a question. The students who are in person can ask the same question, and it's like the teacher is focused on one thing. So you have that opportunity for immediate feedback. There's an opportunity for collaboration between students who are in person and students that are at home. You might choose to pair a student who is working on a project at their home and in person, and they can log into their devices and talk to each other at the same time. And this would be the most simplified planning. Okay, so some considerations that I'm going to share are considerations for almost all of the models. For example, what are we going to do when we have tech issues? No matter which model you choose for green plus red, that would be a similar consideration. How will you address those behavior issues for your in-person students? Planning for those early finishers? And how will you teach those routines and expectations to all your students? And then what materials do your students who are at home need so they can participate in an equitable way with the same learning that's happening in the classroom? If we have a whole group lesson where we're using the same materials, do my students who are at home have the materials to participate in the lesson the same as my students who are in the classroom? All right, so this model might be for you if you do not like to record yourself on video. In this scenario, you do not have to. There's a big emphasis on live streaming. If you prioritize whole group instruction, if your students struggle completing work on their own, if you are looking for a more consistent instructional delivery, you're able to send some home materials to those students for those students to use, and if you are comfortable using those technology tools to make it work, this would be that model for you. And so this is where we're going to pause for a minute and allow you to just take some notes in that note taker. And again, that's on page 3 in that little 4 square on the synchronous model and whether or not you think this is the right model for you. Okay, we're going to move on to semisynchronous. And semisynchronous, just as the name would indicate, is very similar to synchronous. There is a mix of those synchronous and asynchronous learning times to give more flexibility to the teacher, so that you can work in some more small group and differentiated work for your students. If you are teaching Edgenuity, this is the model we would suggest for that curriculum. Again, we have a visual on the left and 2 articles we highly recommend for you to explore more. So when we move into the schedule, what we're going to notice is that it is structured very similarly to synchronous, but with a little bit more flexibility for the teacher in terms of giving more control over to her students on what they work on so that she can meet with other groups. So we can go ahead and advance. Thank you. So again, we would start with that whole group morning meeting. We would have a whole group mini reading lesson. And then this is where we have some more flexibility, where our students may have some asynchronous work that they are doing. So we are, maybe 3/4 of my class are working on an asynchronous activity for the reading lesson. And then the other group that I'm pooling is able to do guided reading with me. And so we're thinking about that time we have and thinking a little more creatively in terms of what my students can do themselves versus what I need to actually do with them so that we can maximize our time together. The same thing would happen throughout the day, where we have our phonics lesson, and then we can break into those small groups. And so throughout the day, you would have the more opportunity to meet with smaller groups of students. Some benefits and considerations for this model are similar to synchronous. Students do receive that same instruction at the same time. They have that opportunity for collaboration in person and students at home. It is simplified planning compared to the other models, and it includes some off-screen asynchronous time. So there's some big benefits for our students. And similarly, our considerations are just the same as synchronous, except the very last one. What accountability measures will you include for asynchronous work? If your students are going to log off their devices while you meet with a small group, we need to have independence for those students, but we also need to have a way to know that they are completing the work that they're doing. And so this model might be the model for you if your students have some of that support at home so that they can work on those independent tasks. If you don't like to record your lessons in a similar way, your students have that capacity to work independently, you're looking for a more consistent instructional delivery method, and you're able to send some materials, tools for students to use so they can engage in that same whole group lesson. And if you need time to meet personally with those struggling students or smaller groups, this would be a model that would benefit you the most. So again, we are going to pause for a moment so you can take some notes on semi-synchronous, and then Maggie is going to take over and share with you flipped.
All right, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at the other two models that we have that could potentially work in your classroom. And so our next model is the flipped model. And essentially in this model, the students engage with direct instruction and introductory content through some kind of instructional video or support asynchronously prior to that in-class learning. And when they're with you in that in-class learning, they are diving into deep application of knowledge with collaboration, projects, labs, classwork, and all of that with you. So that way you can really focus on that deep dive into content. And then outside of class after that, they can engage in some independent practice work or some independent reflection and development on that concept. And so let's take a look at what this might look like in the classroom here with a schedule. And so this is one potential way that it could work, where when we're in small group synchronous instruction, we are really focused on those collaborative structures where the students are really diving in deep with the content, they're interacting with you, they're talking about the things that they learned from your short instructional video or the things that they practiced from that independent component. And when they're in those asynchronous moments throughout the school day, they are either watching those instructional videos for further support or they're watching the ones for the next day. And they're engaging in some of that independent practice to kind of prepare for the discussions that you're going to have in your classroom around that content. Now, the nice thing about flipped classrooms is that they've been around for a long time. These are not new ideas. And often, many teachers have embedded flipped classroom practices while they were in-person teaching with their students in the classroom and have made it work really well for our little ones. And so with this type of a schedule here, you are really focusing on that synchronous time, regardless of what content you're teaching, on that deep dive and application of knowledge. And that asynchronous time is really for those short instructional videos on key components of your content that you need the students to engage in before they get to your before they get to your synchronous component. And then they may also be engaging in some independent practice to apply a little bit of that concept and start processing what they might be doing when they're in those synchronous instruction components with you. And so some benefits and considerations for that would be for the students to really focus on that hands-on collaborative application of knowledge. The teacher can really spend that synchronous time with their students with higher level questioning, focusing on that student understanding, correcting student misconceptions so that way, as they're processing the content, they're continuously growing with you. And of course, some considerations that we would want to have for a flipped model is the opportunities for differentiated groups. How are we going to work with our students in synchronous models with that collaborative component where it is differentiated enough and personalized enough for the students? You'll also want to have an accountability system for students that don't complete their asynchronous work ahead of class time. But that's something that you could easily manage into one of your systems where if you are working with a small group of students on one concept or topic, you can have other students even in person working on that asynchronous work that maybe they're really going to need for your whole group lesson, that synchronous component, that deep application of knowledge that you're going to do with all the students. And then, of course, you'll want to consider the social distancing measures and how they will affect the opportunity for collaboration. What structures are you going to need to have in place to ensure that students are able to collaborate in your classroom while also adhering to those measures that are set forth by the PED and APS? And then some considerations for you in particular, if you really want to try out this model, this would be the one for you if you're comfortable recording your lectures. And when we're talking about lectures, they don't have to be super long. They can be 5 to 6 minute little videos. They can be screen recordings of the content that you have on your board. And it's really just about presenting the information in a clear, concise way that makes it accessible for all of your little ones. And then, of course, your students will need to have some capacity to work independently. And so if you're somebody that's been working on that with your students all year long, this could be a good model to adopt. Additionally, as a teacher, if you prefer those multiple and varied learning opportunities, especially in those collaborative settings, this could be a really great model to adopt as well. Additionally, you'll want to have a system to check in with asynchronous students as necessary. And so that can be something that you can just naturally build into your schedule. And if you prefer that students work on more rigorous assignments while they're at school with you, this would give you the opportunity and the time to do that in depth with your little ones. And of course, you'll have to work with your students to work at their own pace for that asynchronous component and ensure that they're able to kind of keep up with the classwork on the asynchronous component as you move through the remaining days of instruction. And so we're going to pause here for a second, and I'm going to give you just a few seconds to kind of take a look and write down some notes about flipped model. Okay, so let's talk about our last model, and this one is station rotation model. This one is a mix of everything. You can get structures from Daily 5, from Math Workshop, and essentially what your students are doing is that they're rotating through a series of learning activities all throughout the day. And those different stations could include a teacher-led station, an online station, and an offline station. And essentially, as you're working through these components, the students are engaged in different activities and working independently while you get to really focus on one small group at a time and delivering that key instruction to your students. So let's take a look at what this might look like in a schedule. And so in a schedule, you may have some of your kids at home and you may have some of your kids in person. And during that block of time that you have designated for literacy, you can split your students into groups where one of these groups is a teacher-led station where you're getting to meet with each of your students, really keying into those reading components that you're looking for them. And then you're able to give that real in-time feedback to students as they're working through the content in your teacher-led group. One of your other groups, like what is listed on here, could be an online station where the students are engaged in a little mini lesson that's from one of our supporting programs like iReady, Or it could also be games, ebooks, any of those extra components that we have through many of our programs that you could assign to students to do online. And then, of course, you have the option of an offline station. Maybe the students are collaborating on a particular project that they're working on that's offline. Maybe the students are engaged in independent practice. And so those are things that you could consider as a teacher for a station rotation. And you can make that work for any of your other subject content areas like mathematics or even social studies and science as well. And so if we go to the next slide here, this is another, my apologies, this is another example of how you could also structure those groups. One of the things we want you to consider with the station rotation model is that it is not one way or the highway sort of thing. You can have a variety of models with station rotation and make it work for you. And that's one of the beautiful things about flexibility and station rotation model is that you can really kind of construct this in a way that makes it beneficial for you and for your students. And so if we kind of go into the benefits and the considerations, one of the benefits is that station rotation model prioritizes differentiated instruction, which means as the teacher, you can really structure your groups in a way so that every student is getting something that they need in order to grow further. The students would have access to whole group, small group, independent learning activities. They could also focus on that hands-on collaborative application of knowledge in one of those groups that you set up. And then, like I said before, you can really provide that real-time feedback in small groups. And of course, some considerations would be the stamina that the students have for independent work. That's something that we'll need to consider as teachers and really build that up with our students. And then, of course, just like other models, how will we address tech issues, behavioral issues, extended work for early finishers, and then the materials and tools within those stations. And one critical component, and this will go for any model that you hear about today, are the routines and expectations that you'll have for those students in those groups, because those routines and expectations will be key in making station rotation model or any model work for you. And so if we think about if this is the right model for us, it could be the right model for you if you prefer those multiple and varied learning opportunities. And with station rotation, you would be able to have a lot of autonomy as a teacher to get those multiple and varied learning opportunities. You would want to make sure that your students have the capacity to work independently, and you would want to engage the students in a variety of activities to really build up that interest and to really get them access to different components of your curriculum. It would give you the time that is needed to meet personally with struggling students or smaller groups and provide that in-time feedback. And this could also be a really good model for you if you're comfortable with both providing synchronous teaching and asynchronous work using multiple tech tools. And so you could really use station rotation model if these sound like things that describe you. And so I'm going to give you a couple of seconds here to kind of just jot down some notes about station rotation model and some ideas that are kind of processing in your brain. And Rachel, I'm going to pass it off to you now.
Thanks, Maggie. So Maggie said this already with that last model talking about routines and expectations. And I just want to emphasize that again, that we're going to have to take these first few days or weeks back in school and reframe our thinking as if it is a new school year, to rebuild some of those routines and expectations for students, to help them navigate what their new learning environment is going to be like. And here we have some resources for you that you might consider diving into as you decide how you're going to structure some of those routines and expectations. So these are articles that we've read over the past few months that were helpful for us. And there's definitely quite a few here on that rotation model, since that is often so common in the elementary setting if you're interested in reading more about that. I also want to direct your attention here to this needs assessment. You can scan with the QR code. You can, if you're following along in the slide deck, you can click on the image. It's also in the speaker notes. but this is really helpful for us so that we know where you're at in your planning process and how we can best support you going forward. So we've taken that information and scheduled additional deep dive sessions into each one of these models. And you'll notice that we have more dates for station rotation and semi-synchronous. That is a direct result of the feedback that we got in the needs assessment, because we heard teachers were more interested in those schedules, so we're going to provide more support around them. So we want to be your voice to be heard and for you to let us know what you need. And then, as I mentioned, you need to start building some of these routines for your students. So these are some additional resources that we've built. We worked with a teacher who's working with students in person. She's a SPED in the Red teacher. So she allowed us to take some pictures of her classroom and how she structured her space for social distancing and how she teaches both synchronously and asynchronously, as well as providing instruction simultaneously for her students that are at home and in person. So you have some student-facing documents here that you might utilize, as well as the original slide deck so that you can make some modifications for what your classroom looks like to start sharing that with your students. And then we are a minute over, so I'm going to just share this last slide here with you. Again, just further resources. You can reach out to us, our entire team at tlnteam@aps.edu. You can click here to visit our website and find more resources, recordings of this session, as well as recordings of our deep dive, and then connect with us on Twitter or find our PD videos on YouTube. So thank you for taking the time to be here during your busy conference days. We'll hang out for just a couple more minutes if you have any questions.